The shadow. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. Before I acknowledge anything else, I need to pay tribute to my old analyst, Lola Paulson, who delivered a Guild of Pastoral Psychology lecture by the same title in October 1962. In her lecture, she referred to literary sources which she summarized in order to illuminate particular features of the shadow. In addition to The Tempest, Lola Paulson referred to Herman Melville's Pierre or The Ambiguities, Hans Andersen's The Shadow, Samuel Butler's The Way of All Flesh, and James Hogg's Justified Sinner. I intend to reverse Dr. Paulson's procedure by starting with some thoughts about this archetype, then take a look at the psychodynamics which are derived from it, and offer some private theoretical formulations in the end. By proceeding in this order, my circuitous route will bring me back to The Tempest, and I hope to share with you on the way some personal experiences. One of the most thought-provoking questions which I had to face since I decided to return to the subject is whether the archetype of the shadow is really any use in our clinical work. Have we not got enough psychoanalytic concepts, structures, defenses, and sources of psychic energy to dispense with this and other archetypes in our daily work? Is it only when our identity as analytical psychologists, Jungians, is questioned in public that we fly the archetypal flag? If the answer to that question should be in the affirmative, we would be open to the charge of hypocrisy. Similarly, if in our papers or theses the issues raised and illustrated by clinical vignettes could just as well stand up to inspection, would be just as theoretically convincing and probably equally therapeutic without references to Jung, one wonders why he and his concepts have to be dragged in. In saying this, I'm well aware that I'm touching on the shadow of a group, that is, the SAP. I'm careful enough to include myself because I don't underestimate the danger of arousing the collective shadow of establishments. More about that later. Right now, let me begin again by quoting Jung's simplest definition of the shadow from the Psychology of the Transference, 1946, where he states that on the road to wholeness, the first thing a man encounters is his shadow, the thing he has no wish to be. Immediately questions arise. What does he want to be? Secondly, what does he do about it when he notices the difference between what he wants to be and what he is? The first question brings us into the area of analytical structures. Ego-ideal, self-object, and narcissism are familiar counterterms. So are identifications and group identity, all of which the shadow induces. The second question, what does he do about it, brings the equally familiar defense mechanisms to mind, notably projection, projective identification, splitting, and the mobilization of aggression and the destructive or death instinct. We see that Jung's deceptively simple definition takes us into the very complex network of psychoanalytic concepts and mechanisms which have one very great advantage over archetypal imagery. They offer detailed explanations, hence interpretations, in contrast to the much vaguer, uncontrollable effect of the image on the individual. Although the affect aroused by the shadow is quite easy to empathize with, it is hard to contain and even harder to transform and reconnect with other forms of libido by an analyst who lacks explanations and the technique of mutative interpretations. How did the writers I mentioned cope with the situation? Of course, they did not have any clinical responsibility, but had instead to find plausible images of transformation which helped the reader or audience to realize what was happening, to follow the plot. Without a reasoned explanation, they were able to understand. How much, I wonder, of what is really therapeutic in analysis happens to take this path to understanding rather than that of the controlled mutative interpretation. Herman Melville, in the story mentioned, used a tiger, just as he deployed a whale in his later classic of Moby Dick and his paranoid victim, Captain Ahab. Shakespeare, in The Tempest, invented the infrahuman Caliban, and I think also the superhuman Ariel, both of whom had been Prospero's slaves. In Goethe's Faust, we recall that a black poodle served Mephisto as a temporary abode. It seems, then, that recognition of the animal within ourselves, or at least of the animal or monster into which we traditionally project our shadow, is a precondition to man's own transformation. But caution is indicated. The transformation may not happen at all, and even if it does, it is never once and for all. Like analysis itself is an interminable process for its devotees, so the shadow, the thing that we do not wish to be, can at any time become thoroughly beastly again when it is lost from sight. Neither images of transformation nor the integration achieved by interpreting analysts are likely to banish the shadow for long. The animal then signifies the instinct-driven creature of dumb strength, maybe, but compelled to repeat endlessly and without reflection its inborn patterns of behavior. Ideal, therefore, for the projection of our own helplessness, as well as of the illusory strength we refer to as omnipotence. It is our transformation, our acceptance of helplessness, that in fiction liberates the animal or monster and its master. But in real life, this does not last, and the craving for power is the greater and the more subtle, the more we believe to be free from it. I shall presently give some examples. Here, I would only mention that people engaged in the helping professions are not immune to this danger, as Guggenbuhl Craig shows in his book, Power as Danger in the Helping Professions. Another curious fact has to be recorded. Analysts do not talk about dumb animals, of which they are often quite fond. Instead, their association word to the stimulus helpless is baby. Being genetically orientated, this is not surprising, but suspending our judgment about what babies feel, it seems to me that under ordinary caring conditions, babies are by no means helpless, although they are dependent. We are forced to the conclusion that there is no escape from the shadow, although moments of integration may make it look as if there was. Nor is living the shadow or acting it out a way of escape from conscience, guilt, shame, and remorse. One might as well try to live without a part or organ of oneself. This is indeed what some of the heroes in our fictions had been doing. The man who lost his shadow in Andersen's story, Prospero and Faust, are all described as scholars, not interested in worldly goods and power. On the other hand, both Prospero and Faust practiced magic. One could therefore say that they craved extraordinary power, that is, the power to control their fellow beings. Clearly, like analysts, these characters believed that their knowledge was so powerful that they could afford to neglect aspects of real life for which they were too busy. And this works well enough until something unplanned happens, or they meet other magicians. What happened to Prospero and Faust brought them face to face with conflicts they had hoped to avoid. In case this is beginning to sound like a cautionary tale, let me say what the burden of my argument is going to be. 1. Analysis based on Freudian concepts does not neglect the shadow. On the contrary, it hardly deals with anything else than what or how a person does not wish to be. It aims to undo those repressions in which we hope to cope with our beastliness, miseries, and helplessness. 2. What psychoanalysis has until fairly recently disowned is a man's need for illusions and ideals. That word, ideals, alone acts on analysts like a call to arms. The battle cries are splitting defenses, omnipotence, paranoia. In view of the great gains in man's consciousness of himself, gains which could and are from time to time lost again, this alarm is very understandable. The only thing is that we cannot live by bread alone, hence the need for illusions and ideals such as art and religion offer. Few professionals seem to me as hungry for art in any form as analysts are. And their search for ideals say in the form of what the ideal qualifications and training should be, is unending. The ideal patient, I gather from throwaway comments at the end of more than one case report, is the patient who becomes powerful, rich, and famous, and has developed his creative artistic talents in the course of his analysis. This in addition to all the ordinary aspirations of mortals which have also been more or less fulfilled. Here then is a return of ideals and illusions by the back door or entrance to the consulting room. 3. Jung's archetypal psychology seems to have two advantages over the causal determinism of psychoanalysis. A. It does not have to make patients of people inasmuch as it applies to everybody. Persons are differently endowed by their genes to cope with the impact of archetypal conflicts, that is, between archetypal configurations, say the shadow, and themselves. We do not know whether Prospero and Faust had traumatic experiences as infants. We can stipulate, and no doubt find it sometimes confirmed, that people who seek power by any means do counteract their early helplessness by striving for omnipotence. But the stories and plays would not have achieved popular success unless we could discover ourselves in them. As Winnicott once remarked, everybody is an abandoned infant. B. The other advantage is the superior descriptive power of images such as those which we meet in myth and fiction. These bind the elements which they contain in their appropriate relation to each other. For example, in the story of the fall, the pleasures of sex for its own sake and the horror of shame of banishment are bound to each other and fixed in their relationship. The analytic question is whether or when an interpretation of a private myth, say of a dream referring to incest, still needs to be translated in prosaic detail in order to transform the patient's psyche from a relatively unconscious to a more conscious state, or whether this would better be left to the impact of the dream image without further intervention. Although I cannot answer the question by rule of thumb, I'm pretty sure that analysts feel quite often as if they were not doing their job if they are not feeding the patient with interpretations. In other words, We do not have to be overzealous in the pursuit of infantile trauma. 4. Such reflections make me wonder whether we, in our efforts to uncover individual sources of suffering, do not underestimate the autonomy of archetypes such as the shadow. There are, in my view, two possible ways of using the word collective, as in collective unconscious. The first is that we mean a factor that enters into everyone's life, like the neglected or abandoned infant I just mentioned, who tries to control his environment. Let that be known as the inside-out aspect of collectivity. The second would be to grant the shadow externality, as it were. That is, it is about in the world in which we live, like devils and deities were supposed to be. We have to recognize it, pay tribute to it, and by so doing hope to find a mode of coexistence by giving the devil his due. What I further have to say deals with mainly my personal experience of the phenomenology and psychodynamics of the autonomous shadow. It is a formidable, perhaps the most formidable power in the world, which we learn to suffer. Meeting the shadow is part of our collective psychopathology, and the psychopathology of each individual is a reflection in minute particular. Let me illustrate now the shadow as the quasi-external, autonomous force in the world by quoting selected personal encounters and also from some reading that caught me by the throat. When I was a very small boy, at the end of the First World War, I went with my nurse to welcome back some German cavalry. They were Uhlans riding proudly on very tall horses. There was jubilation among the population, who received the troops smilingly with cigarettes and flowers. Everybody seemed happy, and church bells rang, as they had done on several occasions when victories were celebrated, as my mother had explained. Shortly afterwards, the Rhineland was occupied by French troops. My friend and I went watching their military parades. Utterly fascinated, we found ourselves imitating their martial music and the way they marched and presented arms. This did not prevent me from having a fantasy of possessing a gigantic broom with which I could sweep the whole army into the Rhine. I'm using these reminiscences to illustrate how easily the idealization of power overpowers us, and how seductive it is to identify with it in perfect innocence, until we are forced to have second thoughts. Here is another example. A Romanian writer, Petru Dumitriu, in his great novel Incognito, described examples of changes of loyalty in the story of the young hero who was swayed by the changing fortunes of the Second World War. He watched how a man, suspected of being a spy, was marched by his German captors through the town to be put against the wall and shot. But what really horrified the onlooker was how the wretched prisoner marched in perfect step with his execution squad. It is the very rhythm of power which can reduce an apparently rational human being to become identified with the robot that kills him. Whether we call such phenomena participation mystique, or identification with the aggressor, or introjective identification, makes no difference. We are rendered powerless at the time. Only on recollection can we feel a little ashamed, or at least humble. Here is an example of the divisiveness of the shadow, which I experienced when, at the age of 20, I had emigrated to South Africa. In Johannesburg, I had been offered a place at the medical school to continue my studies, and with that, a new start of life. But if I had thought I had escaped anti-Semitism, racial prejudice, and hierarchical segregation, I could not have chosen a better place to disillusion me. There was very little fraternization between the three competing sections of the whites, who were mainly of Dutch, English, and Jewish extraction. Only when it came to practical matters were all three united in their unquestioned belief of superiority over the black man, who seemed to belong to a different species. I also remember the first time when, of a Sunday afternoon, one of the native servants called a boy, although he was a man twice my age, asked me to sign a piece of paper called a pass so that he could go to town without being arrested by the police. The black population was also split. According to tribal factions and quarrels, they bashed each other's skulls in on Saturday nights. Very soon I was sucked into the social system. Of course, the color of the skin had not mattered in Germany as long as it was not black. Now I discovered that most Asiatics were also colored and thereby tainted. I had wanted to visit the cousin of an Indian friend of mine who had been a fellow student in Germany. But my relative expressed some horror and told me that one could not be on social terms with a colored person. To my shame, I bowed to her superior knowledge and judgment. The divisive and contagious effect of the shadow, by means of corrupting influence of power, is admirably described in George Orwell's classic Animal Farm. We enter the cycle which leads from oppression and decadence to revolution and the institution of an egalitarian animals' republic. There is as yet no Führerprinzip. Each animal works according to his capacity for the common good. But it soon transpires that the animal's endowment to do so differs, and a ruling caste, the pigs in this case, emerges. The lower creatures have to work harder, but are mollified into acquiescence by reminders that they are now free. When that isn't enough, and the new regime fails to prosper, a witch hunt is instituted by the leadership, and the scapegoat has to run for its life. When discontented about reduced, so-called readjusted rations and increased working hours threatens the leadership, a few of the guilty animals are made to confess their sins and are viciously executed by the dictator's bodyguard. The original commandment, "No animal shall kill another animal," is amended by "without cause." The book ends with the tragic realization that the animals are back to where they started. Their ideals have been destroyed, their future is hopeless, their rulers have become tyrants. Orwell did not have to explain his story. Although we recognize this archetypal pattern, we seem nevertheless compelled to repeat it. Why can we not learn from experience? The brief answer is because the shadow can operate on a reflex-like, quasi-physiological level, the level we share with dumb creatures incapable of reflective thought. It is for this reason that I introduced examples referring to martial music and rhythmic marching. A level, that is, to which we can all quite quickly be reduced as in times of starvation. First the grub, then the morals, says Brecht in The Beggar's Opera. But while the shadow in those circumstances may be said to be of survival value, it is quite obvious that Pleasure for its own sake, whether on the oral, anal or genital level, is harder to condone. I'm reminded of St. Augustine and his pear tree. We know from his confessions that as a boy, accompanied by others of the same age, he despoiled a neighbor's pear tree. This would not have been so terrible if he had been hungry and if his parents had not had better pear trees at home. But he was inspired by the wickedness for his own sake, and this it was that made the deed so unspeakably bad for him. Although most of us would shrug this off as mere mischief, in principle it is the wickedness for its own sake that matters. It does not help to attribute St. Augustine's exaggerated conscience to his psychopathology, nor to suspect that he probably displaced guilt feelings about some other pleasure onto this peccadillo. The circumstances under which the usual defense mechanisms, repression, denial, projection, etc., help us to remain who we would like to be, are analyzable, because definite images, myths, symbols, and appropriate affects have already evolved. It is quite a different story when bloodlust, the pleasure taken in killing, has been sanctioned by wartime conditions. The will to survive and the identification with a just cause and love of one's country make us blind to the horrors of intoxication. To kill for the sake of revenge, for example. For the sake of avenging one's gods and destroying usurpers, holy wars have been invented. Uniformity expressed by means of a uniform is of great help in distinguishing us from them, and for the creation of a comradeship which is rarely achieved in peacetime, as is also the admiration of and identification with heroes. The uniformity, the levelling out of differences, must be in constant readiness in our lazy minds. How else could solid citizens have repeated the World War I saying in the Second World War, namely, that the only good German was a dead German? I can confirm that no one is immune to such primitive feelings by recollecting how, when I was serving with the South African Army Medical Corps, an enemy bomber flying low was shot down by our fighters. There were shouts of joy from us as it burst into flames. I remember with shame when I saw how I felt when I saw the charred and bleeding pieces of flesh, and the relief when I could do something for the wounded man who, no longer an enemy, became a grateful individual. Without such recollections, I wonder whether I would really know what it means to be overpowered by the shadow. If anyone should think that this collective archetypal power was confined to wars, large or small, let me remind him of James Hogg's Justified Sinner and the Bacchae by Euripides, where this was not the case. Here is an excerpt of the former. The hero of the story is a minister of the gospel in a fundamentalist church. He perceives the folly and inconsistency of ministers in spending their lives remonstrating with sinners whom the Maker had, by an unchangeable decree, doomed to destruction. How much more wise it would be, thought I, to begin and cut off sinners with the sword. He continues, should I be honored as an instrument to begin this great work of purification, I should rejoice in it. In the Bacchae, the women followers of Dionysos rebelled against the king, who disapproved of their orgiastic rites. Among the Maenads is his mother. In a state of frenzy, she tears her own son to pieces. Holding his head in triumph and believing she has killed a lion, her father gradually makes her see what has happened. Now, someone might think that the minister in James Hogg's story was suffering from religious mania and that the king's mother in the Bacchae was in a state of intoxication, and in this they would not be wrong. Only the conclusion that such things could not happen to people like ourselves would be wrong. Now to return to the question why we cannot learn from experience. I should like to offer some reflections in lieu of an answer. The first concerns the shadow in relation to institutions to which in one form or another we all belong. The power, as well as the identity-lending rewards which the shadow offers us in return for our agreeing to forfeit our souls, should never be underestimated. We cannot remain forever vigilant against these and other stealthy seductions. What we can do is what Jung did in his consulting room. We can leave a chair for his shadow. Obviously, this is not to be taken literally, nor to be imitated. We all have to find our own way of implementing the metaphor. Secondly, some constructive view of the shadow, at least in its more developed image state, would presumably help to prevent it from becoming too ravenous. Perhaps it would be wise to let it amalgamate with other archetypes in order to reduce its fissile, splitting propensity. The shadow's capacity to amalgamate with other archetypal images resembles that of Mercurius, who can also appear, like other gods, in many guises, for example, as devil or trickster, or in animal form. As guiding savior, he seems to have Luciferian qualities. Jung refers to Christ and Satan as both being brothers, having been born of the same God. Albeit hostile antagonists, they are also the offspring of the same deity. We dismember them at our peril. For Neumann, too, the shadow is more than a hostile brother, a companion and friend, the twin of the self. According to him, the shadow is the doorkeeper, and the way to the self must lead through the gate of the shadow. Neumann is here concerned with a systematized outline of personality development. I'm in agreement when he writes that friendship with the shadow leads to friendship with the self. However, I fear these abstractions, as they also lead to idealization, and I cannot be equally optimistic. Third, from the analytic point of view, the reflex type, pre-psychological, mindless aspect of the archetype is by far the most dangerous, since it harbors the element of destruction, simplification, and dehumanization by reducing fellow humans to a thing level. I have already referred to our lazy minds and would emphasize that I regard this laziness as more insidious and contagious than repressions which can be analyzed. If I were to refer to this laziness after Bion as censor and beta elements, members of the SAP would probably know what I mean. It does not matter very much whether we call this level on which no learning can occur psychoid after Jung, or beta elements after Bion. More important is whether anything can be done about it. According to Jung, there is the weather eye to be kept open for constructive possibilities. Bion, on the other hand, uses his myth of the alpha function and is hopeful that the analyst, mother, can do some transforming of beta elements for the patient infant by means of reverie, which is a way of using the alpha function. My own bit of hopefulness comes close to what I think Shakespeare implied in The Tempest and other plays. It is the theme of reconciliation with the help of the younger generation. In other words, Eros as a counterbalance to Thanatos. We can do no more than provide the conditions under which regeneration and rebirth can occur. In conclusion, during this paper, I have questioned the transforming power of interpretations insofar as permanent or collective aspects of the shadow are concerned, and its manifold manifestations in the individual. I have also drawn attention to the laziness of mind which afflicts us as individuals, and even more so in groups. Additional means of transformation have been referred to. Examples were reverie and rituals. End.